Adrienne holds a master's degree in museum studies, as well as bachelor's degrees in history and anthropology, and she is the executive director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, and previously worked as at the President James K. Polk State Historic Site. Adrienne, welcome. What are you sharing with us today?
Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. It's so great to see you here today. Today, I'm going to be talking about civil rights history in North Carolina, most tied with our North Carolina Civil Rights Trail, which is a program of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. But thank you, Sally, for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. We'll head on to my first slide here and just tell you a little bit about who we are at the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. You've likely never heard of us, and that's okay. We are a sister division with the North Carolina Museum of History, so also with state historic sites, state parks, a lot of those big state entities that you've heard of, but we ourselves work with all of these sister entities and also across the state supporting all things African American history, art, and culture. We like to preserve, protect, promote. Those are the things that we're most focused on. And we have a number of our own projects and initiatives across the state, like the North Carolina Civil Rights Trail that we're going to talk mostly about today. So in terms of civil rights in North Carolina and what we're going to talk about, I think I really want to make sure that we have a couple of takeaways with it. So one, I want to emphasize, a lot of times when we talk about civil rights, we hear about Martin Luther King and some really big names and figures, and those people are really important in civil rights. However, here in North Carolina, it's also about everyday people. It's about students. It's about young people who saw injustices happening in their communities and wanted to make a change. So that's really something that I want to emphasize and make sure that's clear to you all today. So civil rights in North Carolina, it happened across the state. It happened with everyday people in small towns too. So I think a lot of times we think about Greensboro, Raleigh, Durham, Charlotte, but it also happened in a lot of small towns across our state where people took this stand. So I really want to emphasize that for you. While we get started, we're going to roll into a few multiple choice questions that I have for you all. So they each have answer choices, A, B, C, and sometimes D on them. So we're going to walk through some questions just to make sure that we're on the same page and understanding what civil rights is and what are some terms that we're going to use to talk about and describe it. So we'll take a look at the first question that we have here. So what were people fighting for during the civil rights movement? So selection A, segregation, B, poll taxes, C, equal rights, or D, to bear arms. What do you think was the option that what they were fighting for?
We're going to give folks a minute to put their answer in the chat, A, B, C, or D. And we have C, 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 C.
Okay. Well, you all are all getting the right answer. That's awesome. So we're all starting off on the same page here. Equal rights. So equal rights meant a bunch of different things during this time period. It included things like the right to vote. It included things like access to all different places, schools, places to go out to eat, recreation spaces, all kinds of things. So yes, you are all correct in that C, equal rights. Next question. So have all Americans always been able to vote? A, yes, or B, no? I have a feeling that you're all already doing pretty well here today, so I have a feeling that you're going to know the right answer on this one.
The B's are flying in.
Very good. Okay, yeah. So, and that's part of the reason why civil rights is so significant and important for us to talk about. So, no, all Americans have not always been able to vote in our country, unfortunately. And that was one of the things that folks are really fighting for and standing up for in the civil rights movement, particularly during this time period. While some African Americans were able to vote, some were really challenged in being able to get to the polls. So they had different things like tests that people had to take and just all kinds of really interesting requirements that varied from place to place. And whereas other individuals didn't have to face those problems when having to go to vote. So it was really about fighting for the right to be able to vote without all the runaround. It's something that should be a right to all American citizens. And that was what folks were looking towards. So next question. So this one, I will be honest, it's a little bit of a trick question. So we'll see how you all do on this one. So when was the civil rights movement? Was it A, the 1960s, B, 1941 to 1976, or C, 1993 to 1999?
What does everybody think? A little bit slower.
I told you it's a trick question, so that's all right. We'll talk about it.
I have a lot of A's and a couple of B's.
Okay. So I will say A is not a wrong answer. A lot of what we think about during the civil rights movement did take place in the 1960s. You might be familiar with things like the Civil Rights Act, which was in 1964. However, oftentimes when we're talking about the entire civil rights movement, we're actually talking about B, 1941 to 1976. So I just think that's an interesting one because a lot of folks think like, gosh, did it really happen that early? Did it really happen that late? And yes, it absolutely did. Particularly in North Carolina, we see things happening well into the 70s with certain individuals who were still trying to make sure that desegregation efforts were happening in schools and in different places throughout the state. So that's when sometimes people will call it the long civil rights movement. That's what that 1941 to 1976 refers to. Next question. All right, so who was part of the civil rights movement in North Carolina? So that's your tagline on that question. So A, the Greensboro Four, Martin Luther King Jr. and everyday people. B, just Martin Luther King Jr. C, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or D, Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth.
All right, we're going to let people have a moment to get their answers from their students. A, and a couple of B's.
Okay, so B is not technically wrong. He was part of the civil rights movement, but again, going back to my first comments in today's presentation, it was more than just the Martin Luther Kings and the really important people. So, I said the Greensboro Four. For those not familiar, those were 4 students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical University who were part of the Greensboro sit-ins. We've got Martin Luther King Jr. Many of you are probably familiar with him. And then the everyday people that we talked about previously. Next slide. All right. So how did people fight for their civil rights? A, conferences. B, protests. C, voting.
What does everyone think? I'm giving them a moment. I see mostly B's.
Okay.
And somebody said D, all.
That's and that's an interesting point. So I will not say no to the D. So I think primarily when we think about civil rights, we think about protest, but protesting can look like a lot of different things. So I think a lot of times when we hear protests, sometimes people think of that as something a little bit more violent, but something that was really emphasized during the civil rights movement was peaceful protests and how people might get together. So we see things like sit-ins, we see things like, we're going to talk about later on today, swim-ins, just all the different types of spaces that people were trying to desegregate. They would show up as a big group of people to demonstrate and say, hey, we deserve to be here. Protests might also be things like picketing, when you see people with like big signs and things like that walking around with certain messages that they want to share and talk about. I will say, that comment on D, yeah, technically not incorrect. I don't know that I'd say conferences, but certainly gatherings of people. That's something that we see across our state. People would be meeting at schools, at churches, and different community gathering spaces to kind of sit down and talk about, okay, so what are the injustices that we're seeing, and what are the kinds of efforts that we want to make to move forward together to try to make a change. Next question. Okay, well, that was it for our question. So honestly, you all did a great job today. So I really appreciate your participation in that. Thank you so much. The other thing that I want to make sure that we're on the same page is with definitions and some of the words that we use when we talk about civil rights, particularly in North Carolina. So I think you've already heard me talk about today discrimination. So discrimination means the unfair treatment of someone based on their membership in a group defined by race, class, or ethnic group. Then we also talk about integration quite a bit. So integration is the incorporation as equals into society or an organization of individuals of different groups. So when people are fighting discrimination, they tend to be leaning and trying to achieve integration. And then there's segregation. So segregation is the separation or isolation of a race, class, or ethnic group. So again, it's pretty much the exact opposite of integration. Folks in North Carolina were experiencing segregation, and they were working towards integration and equal rights for folks as people. So just wanted to make sure that we were on the same page with that, so that as we're talking and using different language, that we're all aware of what we're talking about. So with that, we will dive into our first example. What we're going to do is walk through a couple of civil rights events that happened within our state. And then we're going to dive in and look at the map. I know that in the description of our section today, we've got that interactive map. The particular civil rights things that we're going to talk about today, these are mostly ones that I picked because they involve students and young people who are involved in this movement. And I thought that that would be something really interesting for you to learn about. So this is about the Adkin High School walkout. Adkin High School was located in Kinston, North Carolina. So if you've got anybody in the Kinston area, it might be something that you're already familiar with. And you can see from this picture here, this was taken back in 2021. And these folks who are standing there are all alumni of Adkin High School. They all graduated way back in 1951, 1953, some of them various years. And this is them celebrating getting a historical marker, a North Carolina Civil Rights Trail historical marker, commemorating the efforts that they made as students. So back in the 1950s, when these folks attended this high school, they weren't really pleased with the facilities that they had at their high school. They felt like their buildings weren't in good shape. They did not have a nice gymnasium. You know, we're really used to school having a really nice gym. They didn't have a place for shop class. Back in the day, I know they don't do it as much now, but back in the day, there used to be facilities attached to schools where you could learn how to work on cars and different mechanical trades, so that once one graduated from high school, they already had a skill set to be able to walk away with. And the students were really kind of disappointed in this. And in their classroom, they learned from their teachers about what civil rights looked like, and that really sparked an idea of them. So independent from their parents, independent from their teachers, the students started to gather and talk about, well, gosh, how would we make a change? How would we try to get equal facilities here, right here in Kinston, North Carolina? So they talked, they discussed, and they made a plan. So what they decided to do was that there was going to be a special announcement made on the intercom, probably not dissimilar from your schools. You know, there's the intercom system so that, you know, when they talk over the hallway in the school, everybody can get announcements at the same time. And one of their fellow students was going to make an announcement. And at that signal, they would all stand up and walk out of their high school with signs, and then be able to walk around and protest. So I always think kind of a fun piece of this story is that their signal was, Carolyn Cofield has left her big red pocketbook, or little red pocketbook. If anyone knows where it is, like, please identify and let the office know. And like, that was the signal, and everyone stood up in their classes and they walked out of the high school. And this, though we call it a walkout, it actually took place over a series of days. And as you can imagine, it was a real shock to their teachers. It was a real shock to administrators within the school district. And they were like, gosh, like, you know, what can we do? The students, they're making a point, and, you know, what can we do to, you know, work through this together and get the students back to the classroom? So they actually were successful in this effort. So I always think that that's a really nice story. And, you know, that's kind of a complicated piece of civil rights. We'll talk about some of our stories later on where it might not have such a clean ending, but in this case it did. School district folks heard them, and they worked towards developing a new gymnasium, a new shop building, and making sure that the facilities that these Black students had access to were equal to other facilities that they were seeing in their community. So this is really a success story. And as you can see, there was quite a crowd of people, even in 2021, who were excited to celebrate and mark the achievements of these young people. So we'll take a look at our next one here while I take a little sip of water. So this one happened in Monroe, North Carolina. So down in Union County, just a little bit south of Charlotte, if you're familiar with that area. So I hinted at this one earlier. This one is wait-ins. So rather than sit-ins, it's wait-ins. referencing trying to desegregate a swimming pool. So at this time in Monroe, North Carolina, this is in the 1950s, 1960s, there was not a place for African Americans to go swimming. The places that they could go swimming, from the folks that participated in this event, they said, well, there was this one farmer's cow pond. There was also a place that was just downstream from a water treatment plant. So not really desirable, nice places to go swimming. And, you know, it gets hot here in North Carolina. Even back then, that was a really common thing that students wanted to take part in. So the students saw this, and they saw that there was the public swimming pool. It was part of a public park right in Monroe, North Carolina. And they thought, gosh, it'd be really nice to be able to enjoy that swimming pool just like everybody else. So not dissimilar from our last effort, a group of students gathered. In this case, they also had the support of the NAACP in their area. So there were some grown-ups that had awareness and involvement, and they wanted to make sure they were supporting the students. And they said, okay, we're going to show up at the swimming pool at this date, at this time, and we're going to try to go swimming. Well, the folks who were running the swimming pool in the town saw this happening, and they didn't like it one bit. So they actually decided to close the swimming pool, and they immediately put a sign down, locked the gates, and then walked away. And not much happened after that. Again, because of the NAACP's involvement, there was some press coverage on it. It actually made national news. But, you know, other than that, locally, no movements change. And understandably, the students were frustrated. So they decided to make plans for, okay, what are the next steps? Should we try this again? What do we want to do? So they repeatedly tried this a couple more times. And increasingly, the crowd grew, and the town saw that this was a real issue, and they didn't want anyone to get hurt. They didn't want this to be a public safety issue. And they, again, decided to close the swimming pool. Well, the final time that they made this effort, they actually closed the swimming pool permanently. Rather than desegregating, rather than building a separate but equal facility, they determined that they didn't want anybody to have access to a swimming pool here in Monroe. And it was shuttered, and I believe it was not used then for, I don't know, about 20 years or something like that. So this is an example of a story where, you know, people took a stand and didn't necessarily get the outcome right at that time period that they were hoping for, which was, you know, really a big disappointment. You'll see the two gentlemen that I have in this photo that are shaking hands. The one in the white jacket, that is Mr. J.D. Blunt. And then his friend is Mr. Yusuf Crowder. And they were two of the youth that participated in this movement. And actually, it got so intense within their community that they were really afraid for their safety. And Mr. Blunt, he actually fled and went to live with his family in Virginia, and eventually went on up to the East Coast to New York City. So it was definitely a case where it was a little frightening, and they wanted to make sure that they could, you know, survive this effort and that they wouldn't become targets in their community. Now, while there wasn't a good, you know, ending at that time, what was really cool is that when we awarded this Civil Rights Trail marker in 2022, the community came together. And it was a really wonderful healing opportunity and a way to kind of discuss and talk about, gosh, this is a really tough history that happened in this community, but they were able to, you know, sit down and have conversations about it. So where this swimming pool is located is actually now the country club. So it's a rather nice, swanky place to go and visit. And it's right when you drive into the country club. And to celebrate getting this historical marker, folks in the community of all different people were invited in to sit down and to celebrate this marker, to acknowledge this tough history, the way that the town had handled it, but kind of say, hey, you know, we are making an effort as a community to move past this, and inviting these formerly young men, now obviously grown-ups, to come back and say, hey, you know, this was a tough history and time in our community, but we want to acknowledge it and not just sweep it under the rug. So definitely an interesting story, and something that we don't often hear about with civil rights. We'll take a look at our next example here. Okay, with the Warren County Community Center and Warren County, North Carolina. Get my little sip of water here. So for those familiar with Warren County, it's just a little bit north of Raleigh. It is considered pretty much a pretty rural community. It's historically been known as a rather Black, a lot of African-American community members live up there. And it's kind of a two-parter with this one. So we've got kind of a photo of a building on the left, and then we've got some young people who were taken a little bit later on our timeline. So the Warren County Community Center really emerged from community members, again, seeing and wanting to make a change in their community. So at this point in time, this is in Warrenton, downtown Warrenton, the county seat of Warren County. And there was no public restrooms, there were no gathering spaces, there was no library or places that African Americans could visit, could partake in. So say they were running errands and going to downtown and they needed to use the restroom, they'd have to go all the way back home before they could use it. They could not check out books from the library and different things like that. So there was a young woman, a young teacher in the community who saw this and thought, gosh, we really deserve better. So she came together with community members and had this idea to build a center that would meet all of the needs that they were hoping for. And she was able to achieve it. This is actually a really unique building in that it was built a way long time ago. I believe it was built in the 1940s, so it's quite an older building. Again, we're talking about kind of the early pieces of our civil rights timeline here. And they built this space. They built this space where they could also have community gatherings. They could have meetings. They could talk about, what was going on in their community. They could, just network and be able to have a place to relax that was outside of their homes, just like a lot of other people were able to do during this time period. Well, that's kind of the beginning pieces of history in North Carolina, in Warren County, talking about civil rights. So there was already people who were looking at injustices and people who, had made a change in their community. Well, years later, I'm not sure if you all have heard of the environmental justice movement, but a lot of people consider the birthplace of environmental justice being right there in Warren County. And really what that means is, it wasn't just civil rights. It was also thinking more about their community and thinking about bad chemicals and things like that. So long story short with that, the government had some nasty chemicals and things that were leached by a company along the roadways. And in order to get those chemicals out of the roadways, they gathered up a whole bunch of soil and they needed to dispose of it somewhere. Well, they looked around in communities and thought, gosh, where can we dispose of these chemicals? And they identified Warren County. Now, when they asked the government, it's like, well, why Warren County? It's like, oh, well, it's rural. It's a fine spot. It won't bother anybody. But community members knew, when you're starting to, basically the premise was they were going to do a landfill where all these chemicals would be dumped. When people start doing stuff like that, it can leach into your groundwater. It can cause all kinds of health problems, cancer, different things like that. And people in the community were like, no, we don't want this here. This is not appropriate. We don't want this in our backyard. That's not fair. And through a bunch of different protests, through engaging with national organizations, NAACP, all kinds of folks, they brought really big national attention to this as saying, hey, just because we're a small rural Black community, we don't deserve to have our groundwater, to have our environment, destroyed by some of these nasty chemicals that are being dumped. So they made an effort. They talked as a community, and eventually, it took many years. This is a long story, but they were able to get those chemicals removed and remediated, as they say. So it did end up having a happy ending, but it's one of those, it took many years. And it's still something that people look back at today because it was proven, not just here in North Carolina, but also in several other communities across the nation that, people were identifying where are the poor Black communities and where can we, put chemicals, it won't bother them. But it was just another form of environmental racism in this case. So a tough story, but again, with an interesting ending. And with that, I think that was our last example. So we're going to take a look and dive into our virtual map, if we can have a moment to do that.
We're going to put up the North Carolina Civil Rights Trail.
Yes. And while we're getting that pulled up, I'd love to hear from you all in the chat where you're tuning in from. Are you joining us from, our western part of the state? So we have anybody out in Asheville? Do we have anybody out in Charlotte area? Are you from somewhere in the middle? Do we have any Greensboro, Fayetteville, or different kinds of folks? I'd love to hear from you all in the chat, because once we dive into the map, we can kind of start exploring, clicking around, and seeing what different places and locations that we're taking a look at. We're doing some technical behind the scenes stuff here as we get this set up for you all. Have we gotten any responses in the chat, Sally, of where people are tuning in from?
Absolutely. We have by counties, we have Alamance County, Wake County,
okay,
Columbus County,
okay, perfect.
Wilson County, Hoke.
Okay.
Hang on one second. We'll get this up. Wilson, Cumberland, Durham, Alamance, Hoke, Fayetteville. And now you can see a live action of the North Carolina Civil Rights Trail.
Very good. Well, it sounds like there are definitely, you all are coming in from some of these smaller towns and communities that we were talking about. So I know one of them that I heard from was Fayetteville. So we're going to take a little zoom in on Fayetteville and take a look at our map here. So one of them, I know we already talked about Adkin High School. I believe it's... So there are actually a couple of civil rights trail markers. So this one is really interesting. This one was the downtown Fayetteville protest that happened in 1963. This was another instance where students who attended the historically Black college and university, Fayetteville State. If you're from Fayetteville, you've probably heard of it. And they, not dissimilar from the Greensboro sit-ins, they wanted to desegregate a department store, in addition to some of their the different kinds of department stores, their theater, and all kinds of things. So rather than just focusing on one business, they really sat down and said, okay, there are a bunch of places that are on our list that we want to take a look at and desegregate. And this one's a really interesting story because it wasn't just students, it was largely students, but also people who were in the service, who were at, now we call it Fort Freedom, back then it was Fort Bragg, also participated in this movement along with community members. So it was a really interesting effort of all kinds of people taking a look. Now, I will let you know, in terms of this particular map, if you're interested in taking a look at it after our time together today, you are more than welcome to and take a look at our website so that you can click around. What I will say is each of them has a hyperlink that says more information, and that links into, and you'll see that listed right here. And then that'll link you to our website, where we have historical essay, we have some pictures and different things like that, where you can really dive in on that research. And let me try to go back on my screen here and X out. There we go.
Put that link in the chat.
All right, perfect. All right, so what else do we have going on in Fayetteville? So that particular marker, just to zoom in closely, that one is located right downtown, and we were taking a look at that. So another one calls out specifically the Woolworth sit-in. So Woolworth's, you may or may not be familiar with it, but it was another kind of a department store, but oftentimes they had a counter where people could go and eat, kind of a diner type situation. And this was just a few years earlier than the last movement we talked about. In 1960, it was another instance where students in their community sat down and wanted to make a change. So that one's a really interesting one as well. And then we've got one more over here. Okay, so this one is not one that I'm not as familiar with. So this one also happened in February 1960. Approximately 40 students from Fayetteville State Teachers College, again now Fayetteville State University, entered and conducted another sit-in. So that's kind of an interesting thing to see, just right in Fayetteville downtown, that between 1960 and 1963, we've got several events that happened. So pretty interesting to take a look at that there. And what else do we got? I think we've got one more over in this corner. So the Evans Metropolitan AME Zion Church This is another 1963. So the Fayetteville chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that's the NAACP, led a mass rally at the church to fight for civil rights. So again, 1963 in Fayetteville was definitely a really active year, which is kind of interesting to take a look at. So let's zoom out and take a look at some other spaces. So I'm trying to remember, I don't think we have anybody in listed in Hoke County.
Cherokee County, Granville County.
So I will say it's an interesting thing, and well, let's zoom out at the whole map in its entirety. So we've got a couple of different layers on this map. Some of them are places that have received a historical marker, and some of them are just events that we identified and we wanted to mark them because we thought it would be interesting to explore them. But you'll notice, we definitely have centralized locations. We talked about cities, although there are more rural places. You'll notice as we get further west, there are less civil rights events that happen. That can be for a few different reasons. The population out west, especially in this time period, was a lot less. In recent years, we're seeing places like Asheville grow quite a bit, but, during this time period, not super common. I will say one that is particularly interesting that we'll take a look at is, I don't know if anybody's joining us from Transylvania County, Brevard. Brevard High School, this is a really interesting story. So in 1962, African Americans could attend the Brevard Rosenwald School until they reached high school, but then were forced to travel to the all-black 9th Avenue High School in Hendersonville. So I don't know if you're familiar with where Hendersonville is, but Brevard's all the way over here, and then Hendersonville's here. And they're not even in the same county. So if you think about that, that'd be a pretty long way that people would have to travel just to go to high school. Definitely a civil rights issue in this case. And it even says here, 42 miles away. And, this is out in the mountains. It's not like there was a direct route. We don't see any interstate connecting between these places. So one would really have to commit and figure out your own transportation to get to Hendersonville. Now, in March 1963, Judge Wilson Warlick ordered the Board of Education to fully integrate Transylvania County's secondary schools, including Brevard High School. Now, in this case, what the marker actually specifically talks about is the Brevard High School football team. Because that first year that the football team integrated, they actually won a championship, which was kind of a really cool thing to see. I don't know if anybody's seen like the Remember the Titans movie or anything like that, but it's almost kind of our own local North Carolina story, similar to that movie, talking about how this team came together and were actually able to be successful. Now, if you take a look at the website and the essay connected to this one, you'll notice it was an interesting situation as to why they actually won the championship. They did not win the final game. Actually, the final game got canceled, and it was denoted as a tie because right around that time period is when I believe it was Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, who was a political figure at that time period, and pretty much a lot of things shut down and a lot of things were canceled. So in this case, they were co-awarded a championship, but still really an interesting story. And Brevard High School is still an active school that people attend, and now there's a civil rights trail marker located right outside. So kind of an interesting and cool story with that one. Sally, can you tell me a few more locations that people are tuning in from?
Sure. Alamance County, a lot of Cumberland County, Columbus County, Hoke County.
Okay. Yeah, Alamance. I don't know. Oh, yep. There is one thing over here in Alamance.
This is a quiz on county location as much as anything.
Yeah,
you're doing a great job.
This is a good quiz for me. I picked Alamance because I knew for sure where that is located. This one's pretty interesting. So this one is titled The Death of Charles Drew. And we kind of categorized it as visits by civil rights icons. So the death of Dr. Charles Drew, who was the first African-American in the research of plasma and the creation of a blood bank, led to many rumors surrounding the hospital, Cone Health Alamance Regional Hospital in 1950. Again, this is a pretty early on, happened pre-1960s. It started the question of racial equity in healthcare. So, kind of like what we talked about earlier, wanting to desegregate, wanting to make sure to have equal rights, equal facilities. It wasn't just places to dine. It wasn't just swimming pools. It was also hospitals. That was actually a really major issue that's talked about in North Carolina. I know particularly in Greensboro and Wilmington, you know, there were issues. They wanted to make sure that they got quality health care just like everybody else. You know, that's a really important civil right as you start to think about those things. So that's kind of an interesting one. And that one is located, so this one's not actually a physical marker, but it's an event. So if anyone's familiar with Interstate I-40, just before Burlington is where that one is, what the place that we're to marking. So I think we also talked about Columbus County, which, Sally, we're going to have to test me out. I don't think we have any in Columbus County. We've got
Columbus County.
I don't think so. Oh, wait, no, there's a blue one right there. Okay.
Columbus and Bladen counties, I know, are the home of the Waccamaw-Siouan.
Yeah, there you go. So this one is marking talking about Ann Atwater, who fought against Jim Crow laws and for equal rights for African Americans in Durham. So she fought in Durham, but I believe that this is denoting where she was born and raised. Atwater and local KKK leader C.P. Ellis chaired a community meeting to handle violence in the recently desegregated Durham school system. She was born here. So that's over in Hallsboro. We'll zoom in a little bit from there. I don't know if our Columbus County folks, it's not too far from Whiteville, really close to Lake Waccamaw and Lake Waccamaw State Park. I don't know if anybody's visited over there, but yeah, little community Hallsboro is where she was from, which is pretty interesting. We'll take a look. It looks like we've got another one right down the road here in Brunswick County. I don't know if that's in Leland proper or if that's in another town. Looks like it's in Leland. Let's take a look at this one. So that's a different color. So this is talking about Lincoln Elementary School, 1951, again, another really early one. Brunswick County built two schools for African Americans. Lincoln Elementary, which became integrated in 1968 to 1969, was one of these two schools. And this is an interesting one because I believe, I work with the African American Heritage Commission, and we have commissioners. They're kind of like board members. And I do believe one of our commissioners actually attended school here. So that's kind of an interesting little connection there over in Leland. Small town. If you're not familiar, it's just right across the river from Wilmington. Another one, since we were talking about high schools earlier, I'm going to try to find, oh yeah, this one. So Dr. Hubert Arthur Eaton, Sr., he was a doctor amongst many other talents. So doctor, civil rights leader, and influential tennis mentor. He was an early advocate for improved schools and access to medical care. He lived in this vicinity, so not far from Wilmington. So he actually worked to desegregate the hospitals in Wilmington. He also worked to desegregate UNCW, the Wilmington location of UNC. And I'm not going to remember the name of the tennis player, but there was one of the first female tennis players pre Vanessa and Serena Williams. He was actually her mentor. So if you're interested in that kind of history, I recommend taking a look at Dr. Eaton and linking to the more info on there, because that's really an interesting story. One of those connections of like, oh gosh, here, right here in Wilmington, kind of a different story to hear. So we're getting really close towards the end of our time here together. I'd love to, again, turn it back to you, see if you had any questions or anything that you wanted to raise up before we finish our time here together. I think we've got just about 6 minutes, so I'd love to have you type it out in the chat. You know, what questions do you have for me here today? Or were there any thoughts of the events that we talked about that you thought were particularly interesting?
Terrific. We will start with some questions while people have a little more time. And was that Althea Gibson?
Yes, it was Althea Gibson.
Okay,
yes, that was the tennis player that Dr. Eaton mentored. Thank you. No, but really, if you're into tennis, that's a very big deal. So a cool tie-in to North Carolina.
So a question we have is the civil rights effort over?
Now, that is a good question. You know, I'd love to hear from you kind of what your opinion is on that. So, you know, we talked about civil rights, how that's, you know, equal rights in all different kinds of places. And do you think that we as Americans have achieved this yet? I think you will find, there are varying answers. When we talk about civil rights movement, again, we say that ends in 1971, but then you see there are different efforts. There are people fighting for equal rights in the workplace. There are still people fighting for equal representation nowadays. So, depending on who you ask and how you're defining it, I think you'll find that many people will say that yes, civil rights are still being fought for today.
Terrific. Why is conversation important to talk about history?
Yeah, that's a great question. So why is conversation important to talk about history? Well, I think that sometimes, and it depends on how you're taught, we can read about these things, but reading and, is one way to absorb the information. Clicking around on a website, that's one way to absorb information. But I think to really understand history, it's good to have conversations. It's good to learn from other people, whether it's your peers, your classmates, whether it's your teachers, your community members, your parents, your family members. And I think that you'll hear that there are different perspectives of history that we can learn from in conversation. And there are also just, it's always more engaging and more interesting to, be able to ask questions and be able to, question what's going on together. I think that that's really important.
Why did people protest instead of just working things out?
That's a good question. So it varies. So some people were able to just work things out, but sometimes that didn't go well. So, for example, like with the students at Kinston High School, Atkin High School that we talked about, perhaps they could have, sat down and had conversations with grownups and community leaders. But, sometimes actions speak louder than words, some people will say. And, sometimes these injustices happened for a long time and there had been conversations which led people to protest. And it's one of those, a more active way to show people this matters to me and I'm not going to forget about it, and raising up and saying like, this is not right. And it's really just a good way for people to grab attention of the folks who are in leadership to kind of say, hey, let's make this change.
Terrific. Harriet comments, I don't think civil rights is over. We are represented in our communities and we continue to work for that. And then we have another question.
Mm-hmm.
What inspired you to learn more about the civil rights movement?
That's a great question. And Harriet, thank you for your comment. I think that you're really thinking through this, so I appreciate that. What inspired me? I've always been a lover of history. I grew up in a family, we used to go to a lot of museums and historic sites and different places like that when we traveled. And the thing about civil rights that was always interesting to me is that this is not that long ago. My parents, so I actually, I have one of my parents is Black and one of my parents is white, and they were born in the 1950s. They were not born in North Carolina. They were born in New York and Chicago. And because of where they lived in more urban spaces, the way that they experienced life was a little bit different than people in North Carolina. But like, these are their peers. These are people that they grew up with, and some of them that they went to college with and are, adults that I grew up with in my life. And it was always really interesting to me to like, gosh, within my parents' lifetime, this was something that people faced. And it just fascinates me. It's one of those like, why did this happen? Why is the world the way it is? I always think that history is a good way to take a look at that and observe it. So, and two, I think the other piece of that is thinking about students involved in this movement. So I think we talk about, young people, they should be engaged. And the civil rights is a really great way to see what young people were doing in this time period. And they were really successful in a lot of their efforts. Did we have any quick questions or any last things here?
I think we're about out of time because the questions we have remaining are pretty large questions.
Okay.
But we have shared some resources in the chat. People are interested in finding out more about the school desegregation effort, major protest in Raleigh, and on and on and on. You've definitely inspired people to do some historical research.
Wonderful.
And we're certainly grateful to you for being here today and for sharing this map. Everybody is interested in the map. I gave them the direct link.
Wonderful.
So I think they're going to explore in their communities. Remember, everybody can continue to learn and do and make history.